So welcome everybody. Thanks for joining into the session. My name is Hilton Giesno, and we are going to be talking about Viva Connections today. I'm sure many of you are or have heard about the Microsoft Viva suite of products, and probably many of you have heard about Connections as well. But in case you haven't, I will be doing a short overview of Viva in general, really short, just a very brief overview of Viva itself. And then we'll look at Connections itself. It's important that we just understand what all the features and capabilities are in the tool. But what we're doing after that is understanding how to get Viva Connections up and running in your organization. Depending on how old your tenant is, depending on other factors you may have in your tenant's life cycle and features you may have and other capabilities in your general 365 maturity, it's important to understand what's available to you and how to get the various elements of Connections turned on. In addition, although these things are kind of sold like all or nothing, what we'll also look at is the fact that you can take different pieces of Viva Connections and turn them on at your own pace. So I'll take you through what I like to call like dialing up the volume dial. In fact, we'll go up to 11 now to 10 on the dial. But just basically looking at different ways you can step into different feature sets of Viva Connections as and when you're ready. So that's a brief overview of what we're going to be talking through. I'll give you a slightly more detailed agenda in a moment. Just very briefly about me. I've been in the industry for a little over 2 decades, 12 times MVP with Microsoft. Obviously, that predates Teams, so primarily on the SharePoint side, initially a little bit in C#, a lot of time in SharePoint as well. And more recently focusing on Teams and SharePoint together. So if you know much about Connections, you'll understand why this is a really a favorite topic for me, working on these together. In terms of actual work, I'm the founder of 2 different organizations. I'm one of the co-founders of a company called Experts Inside, which you might be aware of, particularly in the European region. We have quite a good footprint there. I'm the founder of the South African region in particular, so that's why you may not have heard about me from that perspective. So I oversee the South African and African operations, and we basically work with clients from a consulting perspective there across all the 365 elements and tool sets. Separate to that, I'm also the founder of a company called chitchatter.com, which is a company where we build apps inside of Microsoft Teams, apps for Teams. So we've got several apps in the Teams store. Obviously, I'd love you to go ahead and check those out, and obviously happy to talk about those separately as well. If you do want to get in touch for those, or obviously anything in the session today, though, then I've put contact details up on the side as well. You can reach me on any of the social medias. I'm the only Hilton Giesno in the world, so as long as you could spell my name reasonably correct, you're likely to find me. In terms of agenda, by the way, I am going to go fast. I've got a lot of stuff to get through and discuss with you today. So I will go fast. Apologies beforehand if you miss anything, but of course, feel free to ask any questions in the session, and whoever's moderating, if you can jump in if there's anything urgent. Otherwise, we'll try and pick those up at the end. But obviously, I'm also happy to get in touch afterwards. As I said, on any of the social medias, happy to chat. So, like I said, very briefly, what we're going to look at today: broad background on Viva, diving deeper into Connections, and then looking at some more interesting and advanced kind of capabilities over time. Now, by way of introduction, we've been working, myself and my team, with our clients around ideas. We've been in the intranet portal space for a very, very long time. But as we've gone into Teams, we've been thinking about that as well and trying to understand, where does Teams fit into the picture, and where and how could, some of the things that sort of seem like you could do them in either Teams or SharePoint or Yammer for that matter, what is the crossover? So we've been working on that front for a long time. Some of the apps that we built in the chit-chatter space, for example, particularly aimed at trying to fill some of the gaps that existed out of the box with Microsoft. So when Viva was announced, and particularly Viva Connections, we were very excited. And somebody said to me at the time, "But isn't this just SharePoint and Teams?" And I said to them, "No, that's the wrong way to ask it. This is amazing. This is SharePoint and Teams, 2 of Microsoft's most important, most critical, most fundamental products together." So I like to equate it to peanut butter and jelly. They're great on their own, or jam and such in some countries. They're great on their own, but they're even better together. So as I said, kind of several years we've been looking at this and trying to understand how best to approach it and working with customers in terms of unpacking these technologies. But as we all know, the biggest IT cloud adoption tool ever has been facing us recently. At least that's what I'll call it. Other people refer to it as COVID-19, but I'm sure you're all aware that it's the biggest cloud technology adoption capability that's ever faced mankind. So we've had tremendous digital disruption and digital innovation and change over the last couple of years. So this has come and brought a lot to the table. Obviously negatives in many ways, but many interesting and positive aspects from a digital transformation perspective. However, if we have a quick brief look at the history, Microsoft's been leading up to this for quite some time. And again, I'm not going to focus on these. You can have a look at the slides afterwards. As I said, I'm going to go fast, but essentially, if you look at this evolution, you'll see that Microsoft has been leading up to a far better improved modern experience in the SharePoint platform, and a far greater unity between the various tool sets under the banner of employee experience over the last several number of years. So Yammer has continued to be an investment in Microsoft, continues to be alive and continues to be excellent at certain use cases. Teams, of course, is tremendous at a variety of things. Stream and so on being part of that story as well. But SharePoint being a key part from an intranet portal kind of perspective, and all of these coming together ultimately in the Viva family. Now, if you don't know too much about Viva, just a 1-second overview. Viva was announced early in 2021, so a little over a year ago since the early announcements. And Viva originally Viva consisted at announcement time of 4 different products in the suite. There's a 5th one coming in the near future, so we're aware of a 5th one, but essentially 4 primary products. There's insights, topics, and learnings. I'm not going to go into each of those. There's a little bit of detail here, but essentially each one focuses on a different aspect of employee experience. So Viva Learning, for example, focusing on employee learning and staff training and so on, and some of the other things, providing some very interesting and tremendous tool sets. The primary focus for us today, though, is the Connections product, which is, in a nutshell, not just SharePoint and Teams, but essentially SharePoint and Teams combined together and understanding what we can do with that. So here's a little bit more, by the way, if you are interested in finding out more. Of course, you can Google with Bing Microsoft Viva if you want to find out about the other products. But we're going to be focusing on the Viva Connections part, of course, for this section. Now, in terms of SharePoint and Teams together, there are various ways to understand it. SharePoint is obviously used for many things in an organization. One of the things it's used for is intranets and portals, and that's a lot of what Connections touches on. But SharePoint has been and continues to be used for a lot of other things as well. Here's just a screenshot from something that I'm actually working with an existing client. I'm not going to give you any of the client details, of course, but just to give you an example, this is a modern SharePoint SPFX kind of solution. So it's whatever the line of business challenge that we're trying to solve is. And we often, in most cases with what we're building with clients today, we look to leverage the SharePoint platform, the SPFX modern SharePoint interface and look and feel, and bring that into Teams so that the users can find the applications, a lot of business applications that they need in the context of what they're doing. And this is absolutely combining SharePoint and Teams. However, this is not Viva Connections. The difference, and in fact, there's a session coming up after this where Visa will take you through the process of building and customizing elements of Viva Connections. And you'll find today that sometimes the terminology and the marketing from Microsoft is a little bit confusing. 2 years ago, we'd be building an SPFX web part, and Microsoft would say, look, you're doing SPFX and SharePoint. Today, we're building an SPFX web part, and we're putting it on a homepage, and Microsoft says we're doing Viva Connections. So the same technologies and the same stack, but sometimes just simply what we're doing and where we're doing it may be the change. So the way I like to think of it, when you do sort of face that challenge, the way I like to think of it is this classic content pyramid that we've had versions of floating around for a long time in the industry, which essentially looks at breaking up the content in the organization into kind of managed presenting content, which is essentially kind of the intranet, then team collaboration, collaborative content, and then personal storage. So if you've seen something like this, it'll be familiar to you. Essentially, Viva Connections is playing the role up at the top there. So a simple way to think about them from a product suite perspective is kind of OneDrive and Teams and ultimately SharePoint at the top. But Yammer, as I said, forms part of that as well. You might be using Yammer for other things as well, but it's kind of the combination of these three, particularly SharePoint and Teams, in this perspective of primary corporate communications, intranet style, which is really where Viva Connections falls in. Okay, if you haven't seen Viva Connections, again, I'm going fast, so if you've seen it, it might be a little bit of repetition, but if not, just hang on, we'll go through it quickly. But if you haven't seen Viva Connections, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through a very quick run of a full Viva Connections environment. So I have here a brand new tenant. This was literally provisioned sometime in the last 24 hours or so. I can't remember exactly when, but this is a brand new Microsoft 365 tenant, and it's a demo tenant that Microsoft provides us as partners. And it's one where all of the Viva Connections capabilities have been built in. So what that means is inside of Teams, I can go ahead and access the Viva Connections app. Sorry, where's that gone now? Like I said, this is brand new, and I think this one, I had to rebuild it, and I think we actually don't have Viva Connections in here already. My apologies. I had to rebuild it because there was something broken with this one. Let's see if we can get it up and running quickly. No, we won't be able to. Okay, so I'll fire up another tenant. Give me a moment to do that. And let's just open the correct one. I have so many of these things, so sometimes we lose track of which one's which. But let's have a look at this one. This one was provisioned sometime in the last 48 hours, but it also has Viva Connections up running. Just might take a moment or two to load. Okay, here we go. So this also is a brand new tenant provisioned with demo content. So it's just a nice way to kind of get something visually up and running to show you things working. So it's a tenant that already has some teams created and some conversations in Teams and so on. And it has a sample Viva Connections implementation up and running. So what Viva Connections is essentially is it's a new app inside of Teams. All the Viva things manifest as Teams apps. So you'll see Viva Insights, Viva Learning, for example. They all manifest as apps in Teams. But if I go ahead and click on that, what it's doing is it's bringing my SharePoint corporate communication portal into the Teams experience. So at its absolute minimum, that's kind of what, in a nutshell, what Viva Connections is. It's your SharePoint portal brought into Teams. But there are a few things that make it a little bit different and a little bit unique. First of all, if I go ahead and click on any of the areas in Teams, if I click again, it doesn't do anything. If I go into Teams, for example, and click multiple times, you obviously can't see that, but I'm clicking multiple times with my mouse, it doesn't do anything. In the connections landscape, that does do something different. If I go there, if I click once to go there, it'll load the connections experience. But if I click again, what it does is it loads a multi-level, detailed mega menu, essentially, of sorts. Many of you will be familiar with this. We'll talk through it in a moment. But essentially, it's loading a centralized menuing experience into the Teams experience. So that's, again, something that's different from just simply the web page embedded in there. Another thing that's different is we have this capability in Viva Connections, something called the dashboard. And the dashboard consists of these small little cards. And these are essentially mini micro experiences that we can embed into the corporate intranet. For example, let's say we want to do a COVID health test. We can actually embed a little booking engine, a form directly in there, for instance, or any of these things that we choose can have a more detailed interaction. This is maybe a lunch menu, for example, or it could simply be a link. We can go ahead and click on one of these. I think I forget which one exactly, but one of these simply links out to a web page. So there's a few different kinds of experiences that are available in this connections dashboard. You'll see that I can have large items or small items, so some of them are small squares, some of them are more rectangular. But this is a key element of the Viva Connections toolset, and it's very important that we'll see as we look at the mobile experience. And then the last bit of what makes Viva Connections unique is integration into the search capability of Teams. So if I go ahead and execute a search in Teams, ordinarily I just get the ability to see results in Teams itself. When Viva Connections is up and running, in fact, let's just do that. Let's see what that looks like. So this becomes a search experience of Teams content inside of Microsoft Teams. But when I have connections up and running, I get an additional search, what should we call it? An additional search source inside of Teams, I don't have to be there, but somehow it was locking me. Let's try, for example, in activity. There we go. I get the additional Viva Connections search result option. And when I do that, again, remember it's SharePoint and Teams together, what it does is it shoots me over into the Microsoft search engine with that search experience. As I mentioned, this tenant somehow is a little bit broken, so that's why I was creating the additional one. Obviously, there should be results here. But that's the last piece of the Viva Connections experience. If we have a look at the dashboard, let me just get back to the home page. I just want to tell you a little bit more about what's called the Viva Connections dashboard. So I'm loading up the actual page itself, and you'll see that, again, obviously, as we saw in the embedded experience, we have this dashboard component. The way that I work with this is I can either go see all, or I get a new menu item here as well, which is the Viva Connections menu item in my primary portal, and I can click the View Dashboard, and this will take me here as well. Inside here, this is where I get to edit and modify the card experiences. So obviously simple things like I can drag the cards around to rearrange them, but I also get a preview. As you can see, I'm previewing what that looks like on mobile versus desktop, and I can go ahead, of course, and do things like add new cards, or delete the cards that are there, etc. Here's one that I created just for an example for Tesla. So let's go ahead and re-add that one. I'll add a web link card. One second, I don't know why the card editor is not loading. There we go. Okay, so I've added a web link card. I can go ahead and choose which size of card that I want, and I can go ahead and give it a web address as well. So let's, again, just for argument's sake, I like Tesla's. Let's go ahead and point it at tesla.com. Notice when I do that, it automatically retrieves things from the Tesla website. So it tries to get a reasonable title, it tries to put a description, and even puts an image in there automatically for me. And let's go ahead and make that a large card so that it looks a little nicer. And why don't we go ahead and drag that and maybe make it a little bit further up front. I can go ahead and republish, and we can see that experience now working. So if we go back to the embedded experience, for instance, we should see those cards, the new card appearing and working inside there. Some things to be aware of, by the way. Notice that if I'm a little silly with my card design, I can throw off the design, by using small and large cards in a silly way. So be a little bit cognizant of that. Cards can also be targeted, so that can happen. It might look fine in the ordinary course of events, but that could also happen just because I've got targeting on for the cards, and so certain people are seeing certain things in a certain order. So just pay a little bit of attention to that. By the way, one thing which I didn't tell you is the way that you get the the way that we get the dashboard onto the page. Remember, the example that we're looking at here is a pre-configured environment, but the way that we get the dashboard onto our actual intranet page is that the Viva Connections dashboard itself is simply a web part that appears in the web part list. So we go ahead and add the dashboard for Viva Connections, and you'll see it will bring the items in. But notice that I can have it either horizontal or vertical, but there are some impacts to that. So for example, I can control how many cards show, but there's no sort of sideways sliding on the cards. If I want to make a horizontal experience, I can't sort of let the user scroll sideways or anything like that. You basically just choose how much space you want it to take up, and that's what it does. So just a suggestion: it is possible to do horizontal, but generally the vertical experience is a little better because it kind of naturally scrolls with the page, whereas the horizontal can sometimes mess up your page or look a little bit strange. Okay, so something to bear in mind. So that was a quick overview of Viva Connections itself up and running. If we go back to the slides, one thing I obviously can't show you super easily, but it is a very rich mobile experience as well. So I've got a very quick animation of it up and running here. But basically, the way Connections works is that if you have Viva Connections up and running and configured in your environment, then when a user loads the regular Teams app on their phone, they'll have access to a Connections experience inside the Teams app on their mobile device, so phone or tablet or whatever it is. So here's an example. We have the company Connections app up and running, and if I go ahead and click on that, then I'll load this experience. Notice on mobile though, there are three primary experiences that get shown to me. The first is dashboard. So this is that cards based dashboard that we were looking at. I get a primary experience of using that in mobile. Then I get feed, which is essentially tailored news experiences as part of the Viva package. And then finally resources. And if you recall from the earlier demo that we looked at, this is that side menu that appears here as well, just under a different label. So this experience is what your users are going to get on mobile when they run the Teams app inside of Teams if you have Viva Connections configured. Okay, so looking at it, there are really 4 primary elements to the content that a user is going to see. Obviously, there is the home page, the home site, which of course you all saw in Teams, de-emphasized in mobile though. So if you've got other web parts and other widgets and so on, that won't be visible and sort of a primary content on the mobile device, but the dashboard, the feed, and the resources were. I put this together just to give you an idea of what the kind of primary elements are and what they encompass. But also important, I think, is to understand the nature of what you can do. 3 of these are curated. What that means is that you go and specifically put what you want to put in there. You go and create as the owner of the intranet. You go and create cards and sort them and remove them and so on. And the same for the resources menu, etc. But the feed, importantly, is going to be based on the publishing engine at Microsoft, and it's going to be based on signals to try and drive relevant news to your user, but you don't have direct control over what appears there. The one thing you can do, if we look at a news article, the one thing that we, sorry, that was not the right one. The one thing we can do if we load up an actual article, you seem to just be linking to images. I'm sure we have a nice sample that we can load. Maybe we can even use the home page actually as an example. No, this one, of course. Sorry, let's just find an actual news article. It's a problem with dummy content. It's sometimes really dummy. Let's find an actual page in the site. So here we go. Here's a Contoso news article. What we have is the option to boost the ratings here. And when you do that, what you're essentially saying is I want this to appear higher up in the ratings. But again, as I was saying, you can't completely control what a user is going to see, what news items in what order. You can boost them, but ultimately the ranking algorithm is going to largely control what and how the user sees that. Okay, so we've looked at a lot so far. We've looked at how to get a lot of things up and running in the Viva Connections landscape. What I want to do with the last few minutes that are available to us is just talk you through how we get all of these bits and pieces up and running. Now, we won't have a chance to go through everything in detail, again, just conscious of time, but I'll go as fast as I can to take you through the experience of saying, we have an existing environment, we have an existing Office 365 tenancy, we may have a SharePoint portal or something like that. How do we go about getting Viva Connections up and running, and how do we get how do we maybe target that full experience, but we're not ready yet to resource-wise to start building those little card things on the dashboard, for instance, or there might be bits and pieces that you're not ready to unlock just yet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to dial you through all the things that are minimum bars required to get Viva Connections up and running, and beyond that you can choose kind of which level you want to step into. So the first thing you do need to be aware of is that, if you recall, in the demo environment, Viva Connections is an app inside of Microsoft Teams. So what that means is that there has to be the app experience created and available to the users. So for those who are familiar with the Teams Admin Center, inside of there is a view on all of the apps that are available in the Microsoft Store, or all of the apps that are available in your Teams Store, which is a combination of all of the apps in the Microsoft Store and any additional corporate apps that you may have added to your Teams App Store. One of those inside here, if you go ahead and look for it, is going to be the Viva Connections app. So if we go ahead and look for Viva, for example, you'll see the other Viva products inside there, and there is the Viva Connections app. Remember, I said this is a new tenant, and I couldn't even see it in the store. So if I go ahead and search, you'll see that you have the app available behind the scenes in the Admin Center, but users won't be able to go ahead and install it directly up front. The reason Microsoft's done that, you'll notice that it's marked here as blocked by the publisher. The reason is very good that Microsoft's done that, because remember, Viva Connections is surfacing a modern SharePoint portal into your environment. If you don't have one, then the users are going to have a very strange experience. So if we look at what that looks like, for example, now that I've allowed the app, I'll be able to go ahead and install it as a user. It might take a few minutes just for that to come through though. So let's go ahead and do another search. Okay, it's not available yet, but essentially what's going to happen is if I simply turn on the Viva Connections app, but I haven't yet configured a SharePoint space to work inside there properly, users essentially are going to get quite an ugly experience. I can't remember if I've screenshotted it now, but essentially they'll get an ugly experience saying that there's nothing to show. You have an app available in Teams, but there's no SharePoint site to make available inside there. So the first thing you need to do is you need to make that Viva Connections app unblocked and make it available. And if you want to look at them from a leveling perspective in our dials, you have to have a SharePoint site to embed in Teams. You have to enable that app, but the site has to be a modern SharePoint site. So if you have a classic legacy SharePoint portal, for example, you won't be able to use that as your Viva Connections portal. It has to be a modern SharePoint site. Secondly, if we kind of look at level 2, number 1, we need a site. Number 2, we need to enable the app. As I said, we do that in the Teams Admin Center. I've put a couple of screenshots here as well, just so that if you download the slides, you'll see what's involved. But what we do is we go ahead and enable the app. You can either do it from I did it on this screen before, or you can go ahead and open the app and do it on there. But as I mentioned, I've got a screenshot of it here. If you install that and you haven't glued the two together, then your users will get a very strange experience. This is basically why Microsoft disables it automatically. So the next thing that you need to do is you need to configure whichever site you're choosing, your modern SharePoint site that you're choosing. You have to tell the Office 365 infrastructure that this is the one you want to be your home site, and it'll therefore, after that, automatically appear inside of the Viva Connections experience. The way that you do that, again, depending on how your tenant's configured, you may or may not have done this before, but if you haven't, what you do is you need to go into the SharePoint, your administrator, whatever it is, has to go into the SharePoint Admin Center. You go into the settings section, you go to the home site section. Obviously, pretty intuitive if you know what you're looking for, but this is how you get there, and you go ahead and define which site you want to be the home site for your organization. Once you've done that, then when the user goes to the actual experience, they will begin to start getting a Viva Connections experience in their let's see if we can set up and running. I'm not sure if it's available yet. Let's try. If everything's looking good. No, not yet. Okay. But basically, if they use the Viva Connections app, they'll start to get the experience automatically. They'll get your SharePoint site appearing. However, it's possible to take that to the next level as well. You'll notice that right now, I haven't got it all up and running, but basically I'm trying to search and trying to add the application myself. What you may want to do is level 3 on the dial to sort of start expanding your experience with Viva Connections is to automatically install the app for all of your users. To do that, that's possible in the Teams Admin Center through something called setup policies. And basically what you want to go ahead and do is create or modify an existing policy there. And you can push down the Viva Connections app to be auto-installed for your users. In this example, we'll see later how it's possible to rebrand Viva Connections. I've called it ContosoNet, I've given it a different icon. But I'm basically saying I want to create this new policy and I want to auto-install the Viva Connections app for the users. It's even possible to auto-pin it onto the left menu. So you might want to say, for instance, we want our Connections app to be the very first app that users see up on the actual Teams menu. So that also is possible with setup policies. Now, if you've not used setup policies before, by default in the admin center for Teams, there are always two. There's always a first line worker and a global policy, which is essentially the default. You can modify the global policy and apply Viva Connections here, which is what Microsoft's done in this demo scenario. But if you're setting it up for the first time, what you may want to do is create a new policy, install the Viva Connections app, and then apply that policy just to a subset of users. So the way we do that is we select the policy, we click Assign Users, and we can go ahead and roll it out just to a subset. So we may want to do this, for example, to a test ring of users, just to see what the experience is like before we roll it out globally. So we can create a new policy, test in there, and then either roll the new policy out to everybody or modify the global policy if and when we're ready to go ahead and push connections out. By the way, this is just a screenshot of how it will look, for example, to a user once it is pre-pinned into the menu. Okay, as I mentioned, though, you'll notice in this default tenant, it's literally just called Viva Connections, and it has a default icon. I forget which one we're looking at. We've got so many open now. Let's see if we can find the correct tenant. But it gets this sort of default icon, and it just has literally has the name Viva Connections. It's possible, however, to customize the app settings. So this is again something that's relatively easy to do, but it's a next level of customization. We go again to that app gallery. We can go into the app, and we have the ability here to customize. And in this area, what we have the ability to do is change the name. So we can call it something specific to our brand. We can put in a description. We can even put in things like a policy URL if that's applicable. But certainly we can put a description, and we can go ahead and change the icon as well. So these kind of things visually make the Viva Connections experience customized for your organization. Silly example here, but if your organization is called Contoso and your intranet is called ContosoNet, you could brand the Viva Connections app ContosoNet, and it just makes it a little bit more personalized for your organization and for your user base. Okay, we've seen how to go ahead and do that. Again, I'm skimming through just because we've looked at a lot of things, but I've put all the stuff in the slides just so that you can refer to it later. The next step in the dial, turning up to level 5, is you'll remember when I clicked on the app that we get the customized menu. Now, you don't have to do that. If you have a home site that you want to use, but you've never turned on the global nav, for instance, it's not something you have to have in order to get Viva Connections working. It's certainly something that's advisable and is a great experience, but it's not something that you have to do. If you do want to do it, though, what you need to do is go into the home site and activate the global nav features. So once you denote a site as the home site, then you get additional menu items. One of these, for instance, is the Viva Connections item that we saw before. The other one that you'll get is a new menu item here, which is global nav. Now, important to know, this is useful anyway. A lot of clients, just want, a lot of customers want global nav just because it's useful everywhere in SharePoint. That's the whole point of global nav, but it obviously will filter through into connections as well. So just to see that again, we go global nav. This opens up the left panel, and we can do things like put a customized logo on there and a customized title and so on. But we also have the ability here to go ahead and edit global nav. So this first stage is basically turning it on. And when we click edit, then the edit screen switches over to, well, so maybe we say it differently. When we turn it on, we will automatically have things like the news feed and some of the other menu items that we saw inside of the global nav. If in addition we want to put an actual hierarchical navigation experience, that also is not required, but that is a next level of customizability. So I'm calling that a level on its own, level 6. And what we can do there is we can go ahead and add the menu items that we may want to include in that. If we look at this in context, what I mean by that is if I don't configure those, if I turn on global nav, but I don't configure those, the users will still see my sites and my news and so on. It's this part at the top that you have the ability also to configure if you want to. So that's the additional global nav. Finally, also remember, in terms of this is all optional, you don't necessarily have to configure the dashboard, but if you want to, we saw how to do that before, so I'm not going to focus too much on that. But that's also an optional thing that you can go ahead and turn on. I thought I had a screenshot of it. I must have put it somewhere else. But just one thing to be aware of, though, from a desktop perspective, you won't notice if connections is if the dashboard is not there. You may just have other web parts on the page. From a mobile experience, the users will get a very strange experience if you haven't turned on the dashboard when they go into the Viva Connections on mobile. If you're interested, I can find the screenshot, just get in touch with me. But essentially, you'll get a blank first pane with an error when the users look on mobile. So that is something to be aware of. then with regards dashboard, there's two levels of configuration, because you can add the items to the dashboard, in which case they will work on mobile. You don't have to actually add them to the home page itself, though. You can do them, for instance, only to have them available on mobile and not necessarily on the web page. If you want them on web page, then that is an additional thing that you can go ahead and turn on. And we saw how to do that. We just did it in a horizontal manner, but you can do it vertically as well. Okay, in this example, like we had before, I've got it both horizontal and vertical. And then finally, the last thing we're going to look at in terms of controlling some of the experience is that boost. And I'm not going to spend any time on this because we spoke about it before, but that is obviously the additional option. And the last thing that we touched on is that targeting becomes a widely used capability. Audience targeting becomes widely used in the Viva experience, partly for the dashboard widgets, as we saw, but even things like the news articles, for example, are all going to be driven by targeting. So targeting is something that you want to understand a little bit more. Audience targeting is something you want to understand a little bit more in the Viva Connections space coming from SharePoint. Now, it's a capability that's been in SharePoint for decades, at least one decade, if not more. And it gives us the ability to target content to certain audiences. That can simply be AD groups. So maybe you have a group for each region, or a group for different job roles, things like that. You can go ahead and use those AD or those SharePoint or AD security groups. Or of course, you can create you can create audience that are based on certain profiles. Here's a silly example, but create one called people named Megan for my Megan test user, and basically anybody whose first name is Megan would fall into this audience that we can go ahead and use. So this is another option if you really want more fine-grained control over the audience targeting. Just be aware that in Office 365, the audiences need to do something called compilation. They need to kind of build themselves up, and that happens on a weekly basis. So you may have to wait quite some time if you need a new audience, or if you want to go ahead and modify an existing audience. I've shown you a lot of the connections set up, so we can skip that. The last thing I want to talk to you about, as we've kind of looked on the dial from 1 to 10, we've gone all the way to 10 at this point. I do want to leave you with a final, what I like to think of as an interesting, more advanced scenario. I won't take you through the details of what's involved, but essentially it's possible to create some customized versions of the Viva Connection experience. The Viva Connections apps, all apps in the team store, essentially consist of a manifest, a zip file, which contains two logos. And other than that, they contain what's called JSON. Those who are familiar with it, a specific file in a specific format. Any app in the team store has a manifest like this behind it. And using this mechanism, it's actually possible, if you want to control and customize something that Viva Connections doesn't quite do natively, you can build your own one using this process. So you can go ahead and download a template. I've got a template for this on my blog, for example, and you can modify certain things here rather than using the out-of-box Viva Connections capability, the turnkey one that we saw. You could create your own version of that. And there's two reasons why you might want to do that. And I have another user in the tenant up and running, just to see why we might want to do that. Just found the right tenant, apologies, here we go. So what I've done is I have a different user in the same tenant, and I haven't pushed the normal Viva Connections app down. I've created an additional one for this user or the subset of users. The reason I might want to do that is because I may want them to have a totally different homepage. Now, remember we spoke about targeting. If you just want to turn things on and off, targeting is better, but you may have, let's say, multiple brands in your organization, and you may not want people to see anything at all similar from an experience perspective. So doing this will enable you to do that. That's one possibility. The other reason that you might want to do this is to provide a different search experience. So for instance, the out-of-the-box will use the Microsoft search. If you heavily invested in the PNP search experience, for instance, like I've got in this demo, you might want to have that be the primary search that users see, and that's possible as well, using this different approach. Now, I don't know if this is per se a supported scenario, but I can't see any reason why it wouldn't be. All you're doing is creating a customized Teams app, like any other kind of app that you would build for Teams, and you're kind of combining a little bit of the two together. I don't have an official answer from Microsoft for you, so that's something we could look at if you want to understand the scenario a little bit better. But I just thought it's something interesting that you can explore if you want to look at a slightly more advanced scenario. Okay, we're a little bit out of time, so I don't think there's really much more that I want to show you, other than the fact that we haven't looked at customization. Those Viva Connection dashboard cards that we saw, you can go ahead and build your own cards that can do pretty much anything you want. So I've put a link here to a good YouTube video and another further reading, but there is a talk coming up just after this that you can hang around for if you want to go ahead and see some more details of that in action. Okay, so that was a super quick run through of Viva Connections itself, a little bit of Viva, a little bit of Viva Connections and what it does from a look at what the capabilities are. We've also looked at a lot of the details in and out of the setup, and as I said, I like to see it not as an all or nothing, but as ways that you could potentially step into the Viva Connections capabilities over time. That's all from me. I'll put some contact details up there again. So please do feel free to get in touch on any of these media. And I'm just going to leave you with the rating thing. Please go ahead and rate the session. I hope you enjoyed it. And yeah, thanks. I'm going to stop the screen share now, just to see if there are any questions that maybe came through in the chat. But yeah, from my side, thanks. I hope everybody found it a worthwhile session.